A quiet neighborhood. It was a chilly June evening in 1965 when Evelyn Dupree grew concerned about her elderly neighbors, Fred and Edwina Rogers. The couple, who lived next door in a modest house on Driscoll Street in Houston, had not been seen for days. Known for their routine, tending to the garden in the morning, taking walks in the afternoon, their sudden absence was alarming. Their mailbox was overflowing, and the house seemed lifeless. After days of silence, Evelyn finally called the police to check on them. Officers arrived and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. With growing concern, they forced their way inside, stepping into a home that felt strangely abandoned. The air was heavy, stale, and laced with a faint, disturbing odor. The house itself was eerily neat, with no sign of a struggle. The officers called out as they searched, their voices echoing through the empty rooms. Nothing seemed out of place, yet something was deeply wrong. It wasn't until one of the officers entered the kitchen that the true horror was revealed. He opened the refrigerator, expecting to find nothing more than leftovers and groceries. Instead, he was met with a gruesome sight: stacks of human remains, carefully wrapped in butcher paper and stored in the cold. Pieces of flesh, indistinguishable and chillingly methodical, were stacked neatly, as if someone had arranged them with a butcher's precision. The realization hit the officers all at once. The remains belonged to Fred and Edwina Rogers. They had been murdered, dismembered, and hidden in their own refrigerator. The officers recoiled, unable to fully grasp what they had found. They quickly sealed off the house, the horrific discovery sending shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood. News of the gruesome crime spread rapidly, and soon the Rogers home was surrounded by police, investigators, and a growing crowd of onlookers, all trying to make sense of the unthinkable. The mystery deepened as the investigation began. How had this happened without anyone noticing? Who could commit such a brutal act? As the detectives started piecing together the evidence, they were struck by the calculated manner in which the bodies had been prepared. It was not the work of a random intruder, but someone who knew the house, and likely the victims, very well. The scene hinted at a dark, disturbing secret, one that would soon become known as the Icebox Murders. The investigation begins. The gruesome discovery at the Rogers home shocked the city. Detectives quickly took over the scene, meticulously searching every inch of the modest house on Driscoll Street. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The living room was tidy, with no signs of a struggle. The kitchen, despite being the site of the chilling find, was surprisingly clean and orderly. Yet it was the bathroom that told a different story. Dried bloodstains had seeped into the grout between the tiles, hinting at the brutality that had unfolded there. As detectives continued their investigation, they pieced together a disturbing narrative. Fred and Edwina Rogers had been killed, dismembered, and their remains neatly stored in the refrigerator. The precise, methodical nature of the dismemberment suggested the work of someone who was calm, deliberate, and knew exactly what they were doing. But who could commit such a horrific act, and why? The police had few immediate leads. Neighbors described the Rogers as a quiet, elderly couple who kept to themselves. They were not social, rarely inviting anyone over. However, there was one name that came up repeatedly: Charles Rogers, their reclusive son. According to neighbors, Charles was a strange figure, rarely seen and even more rarely spoken to. Although he lived in the same house, most had never seen him in person, and those who did described him as distant, almost ghost-like. As investigators dug deeper, they realized they hadn't come across Charles's living space. After another thorough search, they discovered a hidden attic door concealed behind a closet. Inside, they found a cramped room that served as Charles's secret hideaway. It was cluttered with books, technical manuals, maps, and a makeshift bed. The room looked like it belonged to someone living a solitary, secretive life, disconnected from the rest of the world, and, it seemed, even from his parents. The discovery of the attic room only deepened the mystery. Where was Charles now? The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever committed the murders knew the home well. Had Charles murdered his parents and fled, or had he been targeted himself? As the days went by, investigators realized that Charles was not just missing. He had completely vanished. His disappearance added a sinister layer to the case, raising more questions than answers. The investigation intensified, but with no trace of Charles and no clear motive, detectives found themselves at a standstill. The scene was too methodical, too precise. Whoever did this had planned it well, leaving behind no obvious clues. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the icebox murders were not just a simple crime. They were the beginning of a chilling, unsolved mystery. The elusive son. With the investigation pointing toward Charles Rogers, detectives began to unravel the mystery of the reclusive son who had seemingly vanished. They learned that Charles was a highly intelligent man, fluent in multiple languages, and a former Navy pilot who had worked as a seismologist. But despite his impressive background, he had become a mysterious figure, avoiding nearly all contact with the outside world. Few people in the neighborhood ever saw him, and those who did described brief, awkward encounters. He would slip in and out of the house, often under the cover of darkness. As detectives interviewed family members, former colleagues, and acquaintances, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Charles had always been a bit of a loner, but in the years leading up to the murders, he had grown even more withdrawn. Some relatives mentioned that he was estranged from his parents, and there were whispers of intense arguments between them. The more they learned, the more it seemed that Charles's life was a puzzle, full of strange and unsettling pieces that didn't quite fit together. Inside the attic room where Charles had been living, investigators found stacks of books on obscure subjects, including engineering, chemistry, and cryptography. There were also piles of documents, maps, and notes, as if Charles had been studying something or planning meticulously. The room was cluttered yet organized, hinting at a mind that was both brilliant and obsessive. To the detectives, it felt like they had stepped into the lair of someone who had been hiding not just from society, but from his own family. The evidence was circumstantial, but it pointed toward a chilling possibility that Charles had not only killed his parents, but had done so with cold, calculated precision. The fact that the house showed no signs of forced entry suggested that the killer was someone familiar with the home, someone who could move freely within it. But if Charles was the one responsible, where had he gone? Despite an exhaustive search of Houston and beyond, there was no trace of him. As the investigation continued, disturbing accounts from neighbors began to surface. Some reported hearing strange noises late at night, scraping, murmurs, and the sound of heavy objects being moved. Others claimed they had seen Charles sneaking out in the early morning, carrying bags that seemed unusually heavy. But these sightings were sporadic, and no one had seen him since the murders were discovered. Weeks turned into months, and the case grew colder. With no new leads and no sign of Charles, the authorities were left with more questions than answers. Had he planned this all along and escaped, or was there another, more sinister explanation for his disappearance? The elusive son had become a ghost, leaving behind only the lingering horror of the icebox murders, shadows and silence. As weeks turned into months, the search for Charles Rogers intensified but led nowhere. Despite a nationwide manhunt, Charles seemed to have vanished without a trace. Investigators scoured airports, bus stations, and train depots, but no credible sightings emerged. The authorities were left to sift through the cryptic clues found in his attic, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. It seemed as if Charles had planned his disappearance as meticulously as the murders, leaving no trace behind. The more time passed, the more the case descended into a disturbing mystery. Detectives could not shake the feeling that they were missing something critical. Rumors began swirling, fueled by the bizarre nature of the crime and Charles's strange, secretive behavior. Some speculated that he had meticulously planned the murders, driven by a dark, twisted motive, and then fled to start a new life. Others whispered that he had been the victim of a deeper conspiracy, that someone else had been pulling the strings, forcing him to kill or be killed. But without new evidence, these theories remained just that, speculation. The once bustling investigation slowly lost momentum. Leads grew colder, and detectives were forced to move on to other cases, even as the unsolved murders continued to haunt them. For the residents of Driscoll Street, the Rogers house became a dark monument to the unknown. It sat abandoned, a grim reminder of the horrors hidden behind closed doors. Children dared each other to approach it, whispering tales of ghosts and dark secrets that had never seen the light of day. As the years passed, the story of the icebox murders took on a life of its own, becoming a local legend. People speculated about Charles's fate. Was he living quietly somewhere, hiding under a new identity, or had he met a more sinister end, buried in an unmarked grave? The lack of closure gnawed at everyone involved, particularly the detectives who'd been certain they were on the brink of understanding it all. In the end, Charles Rogers became a ghost, a name without a face, a presence that lingered in the shadows of Houston's darkest corners. The house on Driscoll Street was eventually sold, and the city moved on, but the case remained an open wound, a chilling reminder of how little was truly known about the lives behind those walls. Decades later, the Icebox murders still stood as one of Houston's most infamous unsolved cases. What drove a man to dismember his parents and vanish? Was it cold, calculated madness, or was there something far darker that no one would ever understand? The answers disappeared with Charles, lost to time, leaving behind only a story that could never be fully told, an unsolved mystery frozen in the silence, much like the grim contents of the refrigerator.